The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Elizabeth Caldwell as she stumbled across the barren landscape. 3 days since her stagecoach had been attacked by bandits. 3 days of wandering through unforgiving terrain with dwindling supplies. Her once fine traveling dress hung in tatters, her fair skin blistered and raw from exposure. "Just a little further," she whispered, her cracked lips bleeding slightly as she spoke. The water in her canteen had run dry hours ago. Her horse, a gentle Marais she'd named Penny, had collapsed the previous afternoon, forcing Elizabeth to continue. On foot, each step became more laborious than the last, her vision blurring as dehydration took its toll. Elizabeth had left Boston with such hope. After her husband Thomas's death from consumption and the subsequent discovery of his gambling debts, she had sold everything to travel west and claim her late uncle's property near the town of Copper Creek. The banker's letter had promised a modest ranch and a fresh start far from the pitying glances and whispered scandals of Boston society. What remained of her money had been taken by the bandits who attacked the stagecoach, killing the driver and the other passengers. Elizabeth had only survived by playing dead, then fleeing into the wilderness when the outlaws were distracted by their plunder. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, she knew her strength was failing. Each shuffling step required tremendous effort. When her legs finally gave out, Elizabeth collapsed beside a twisted juniper tree, its sparse shade offering minimal relief. "Please," she whispered to the empty sky, "I'm not ready to die." As consciousness began to slip away, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. A hallucination, surely one last cruel trick of her dying mind. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a silhouette against the setting sun, a man on horseback, approaching through the heat-warped air like an apparition. Cole Blackwood had not planned to ride through Dead Man's Pass. The desolate stretch of territory had a well-earned reputation for claiming unwary travelers, and he'd intended to skirt its edges on his journey north. But something instinct, perhaps, or simple curiosity had drawn him toward the ancient trail used by indigenous peoples long before white settlers arrived. For 5 years, Cole had lived on the edges of civilization, moving whenever people began asking too many questions. The bounty on his head, $5,000, for the murder of a prominent cattle baron, ensured that someone was always looking for the man they called the Ghost Rider. The irony was bitter. He hadn't killed Sherman Holloway, but proving one's innocence was nearly impossible when powerful men wanted you dead. As he guided his stallion Thunder through the narrow pass, a splash of color against the red earth caught his attention. Approaching cautiously, hand resting on the revolver at his hip, Cole discovered not a trap, but a woman barely alive, judging by her shallow breathing. Dismounting, he knelt beside her. Despite the dirt and sunburn, he could see she was young, perhaps 30, with features that spoke of refinement. This was no frontier woman. She belonged in a drawing room back east, not dying of thirst in one of the most dangerous territories. "In Arizona, ma'am?" he called, tapping her cheek lightly. No response. Her skin was hot and dry, advanced dehydration. Cole wasted no time. From his saddlebags, he retrieved his spare canteen, then carefully lifted the woman's head, trickling a few drops of water between her parched lips. She coughed weakly, but didn't regain consciousness. "Easy now," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "Too much at once will make you sick." Night was falling fast, and Cole knew they couldn't stay exposed. Predators, both animal and human, would be active soon. With practiced efficiency, he gathered wood for a small fire, then spread his bedroll beneath the juniper tree. After settling the unconscious woman onto the blankets, he loosened her collar and removed her boots, checking for snake bites or other injuries. Finding none, he returned to Thunder and unpacked his supplies. As he worked, His mind turned over. The puzzle of this woman's presence. The nearest settlement was Copper Creek, a good 30 miles northeast. What had driven her into this wasteland alone and unprepared? Cole had his own reasons for avoiding entanglements, particularly with strangers. The poster in his saddlebag, the one bearing his likeness, and the name The Ghost Rider, offered $5,000 for his capture. Most of the charges were false, but explaining that to a hanging judge would be pointless. Yet he couldn't leave this woman to die. Whatever her story, she deserved a chance to survive at Dot as darkness settled over the desert. Cole kept watch by the small, carefully shielded fire. The woman's breathing had steadied, and some color had returned to her face as he continued to administer small amounts of water. By morning, he'd need to find more a challenge in this barren landscape, but not impossible for someone who knew where to look. "Who are you?" he murmured, studying her face in the firelight. "And what kind of trouble brings a lady like you to the edge of death in Dead Man's Pass?" The answers would have to wait until she woke if she woke. For now, all he could do was keep her alive through the dangerous desert night. Chapter 2, Shelter, and Secrets. Elizabeth awoke to the scent of coffee. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. She'd been dying in the desert, hadn't she? Yet here she was, covered by a rough woolen blanket, her head resting on something soft. When she tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness forced her back. "Down. Easy there," came a deep voice from nearby. "You're still weak." Fighting against her spinning vision, Elizabeth turned toward the sound. A man crouched by a small fire, pouring something from a battered coffee pot into a tin cup. In the soft light of dawn, she could make out little more than his silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his features. "Who ... she began, her voice emerging as a painful croak. The stranger approached, kneeling beside her with the cup. Now she could see him more clearly, a weathered face with several days' growth of dark beard, piercing blue eyes that studied her with cautious intensity, and a long scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw. "Name's Cole," he said simply. "Found you collapsed yesterday evening. Here, drink this slowly." He supported her head as she sipped the lukewarm coffee. It was bitter and strong, but the liquid soothed her parched throat. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. "I'm Elizabeth Caldwell." "What brings you to Dead Man's Pass, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. Not exactly a popular destination for sightseeing. Despite her weakness, Elizabeth felt a flicker of wariness. This man had saved her life, but she knew nothing about him. The frontier was full of dangerous men. Some wore badges, some carried Bibles, but that didn't make them any less deadly. "I was traveling to Copper Creek," she said carefully. "Our stagecoach was attacked by bandits 3 days ago. I was the only survivor." Cole's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened slightly. "Copper Creek's still a good day's ride from here, even with a strong horse. You're lucky to have survived this long." "Lucky you found me, Elizabeth," corrected, studying him. His clothes were trail-worn, but of good quality. The revolver at his hip was a fine Colt, well-maintained, and his rifle leaned against a nearby rock within easy reach. He moved with the fluid economy of a man accustomed to danger, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You're not. Just a traveler. Are you, Mr. ... She left the question hanging. "Just Cole is fine," he replied, avoiding her question. "And what I am doesn't matter much out here. What matters is getting you to safety." Over the next hour, Cole helped Elizabeth regain her strength. He shared his jerky and hard biscuits, brought water from a hidden spring he'd discovered nearby, and checked her for signs of heat stroke. By mid-morning, she was able to sit up without assistance. "We can't stay here," Cole announced, packing his supplies. "This pass is too exposed, and there's a storm brewing." He nodded toward dark clouds, gathering on the western horizon. Flash floods can fill these arroyos in minutes. Where will we go? Elizabeth asked, still too weak to travel far on foot. I've got a place, he said after a moment's hesitation. Old mining cabin about 4 hours' ride north. Not much, but it's dry and secure. Elizabeth nodded gratefully, though anxiety flickered through her. Accepting further help from this stranger meant placing herself entirely in his hands. Yet what choice did she have? Cole helped her onto Thunder's back before mounting behind her. The closeness was improper by any Eastern standard, but such conventions seemed absurd in their current circumstances. As they rode, Elizabeth found herself leaning against Cole's solid presence, his arm steady around her waist to prevent her from falling. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled north, the barren desert giving way to scrubland dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. Cole maintained a vigilant silence, only occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning of rough terrain ahead. Elizabeth, too weak for extended conversation, drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the horse's steady gait by late afternoon. They approached a densely wooded area nestled against the foothills of a mountain range. Cole guided Thunder through a barely visible trail until they reached a small clearing. There, partially hidden by pines and built against a rocky outcropping, stood a simple log cabin. Not much to look at, Cole said as he helped Elizabeth dismount, but it's solid, built by an old prospector named Jennings. Found him frozen to death 3 winters back. No family to claim it, so I've been using it as a way station. The interior was spare but clean, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Cole quickly lit a fire, then helped Elizabeth to the bed. Rest, he instructed. I'll see to Thunder and get us something more substantial to eat. Left alone, Elizabeth examined her surroundings more carefully. Though simple, the cabin showed signs of regular used dry firewood stacked neatly, shelves organized with care, a collection of books beside the bed. Not the temporary refuge of a passing traveler, but something closer to a home. On the table lay a folded piece of paper that caught her attention. Moving carefully, she crossed to examine it. Her breath caught as she unfolded the weathered page, a wanted poster bearing a crude likeness of Cole. Beneath the name Cole Blackwood, a ghost rider. The listed crimes included murder, robbery, and assault on a territorial officer. The reward, $5,000. Elizabeth quickly refolded the poster and returned it to its place when she heard Cole's boots on the porch steps. He entered carrying a pair of rabbits he'd snared, stopping short when he saw her standing by the table. Their eyes met, and understanding passed between them. She knew, and he knew that she knew. You went through my things, he said, his voice carefully neutral. No, Elizabeth replied. You left it on the table. Are you going to kill me now, Mr. Blackwood? Cole placed the rabbits on the table, his movements deliberate. If I wanted you dead, Mrs. Caldwell, I would have left you in the desert. Why didn't you? A woman who's seen your face, who knows your name, and hide out, I'm a liability to a wanted man. Cole began preparing the rabbits for cooking, his hand steady. Maybe I'm not the murderer that poster claims. Maybe I'm just a man who crossed the wrong people. Are you? She challenged. Cole paused, meeting her gaze directly. I didn't kill Sherman Holloway, though I wanted to. He destroyed my family, stole our ranch, and ruined my name. But someone else put a bullet in him while I was halfway to Mexico. His jaw tightened. By the time I heard, his partners had already pinned it on me, the convenient scapegoat. Elizabeth studied him, weighing his words against his actions. He'd had countless opportunities to harm her, yet had shown nothing but care. I believe you, she said finally. "And I'm grateful for your help. But where does this leave us?" "I still need to reach Copper Creek." "Storm's coming," Cole replied, gesturing toward the window where rain had begun to patter against the glass. "Roads will be washed out by morning. You'll have to stay here a few days until it's safe to travel." As if punctuating his words, a flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the windows. The gentle rain transformed almost instantly into a downpour. "Looks like I don't have much choice," Elizabeth conceded. Cole's expression softened slightly. "I'll take the floor. You keep the bed. And when the weather clears, I'll get you to Copper Creek." He turned back to preparing their meal. "After that, our paths separate. I head north, you go about your business, and we both pretend we never met." Elizabeth nodded slowly, though something about the arrangement left her strangely disappointed. "Agreed." As the storm raged outside, they shared a simple but satisfying meal of rabbit stew. The awkwardness between them gradually eased as they talked. Careful conversations that revealed little of substance yet somehow bridged the gap between strangers and something not quite friends. Elizabeth spoke of Boston, of her late husband's debts, and her hope for a fresh start at her uncle's property. Cole shared stories of the territories, pointing out which settlers were trustworthy and which to avoid. Neither mentioned the wanted poster that still lay on the table, a tangible reminder of the gulf between their worlds. That night, as Cole settled onto his bedroll near the fire, and Elizabeth lay in the narrow bed, she found herself wondering about the man who had saved her life. The charges on that poster, were they truly false? Or was she sharing a cabin with a dangerous criminal, whose momentary kindness might vanish with the storm? Yet something in her heart trusted him, despite every logical reason not to. Perhaps it was the gentle way he'd tended to her wounds, or how his eyes softened when he spoke of his lost family ranch. Whatever the truth of Cole Blackwood's past, Elizabeth's instincts told her she was safer with him than without him in this wild territory. Outside, the storm continued to rage, sealing them together in their temporary refuge for days to come. Chapter 3. Hunters and Hunted. The storm lasted 3 days, transforming the arid landscape into a sea of mud. Confined to the cabin, Elizabeth and Cole established an uneasy routine. He taught her to play poker with a worn deck of cards, showed her how to clean and load his spare revolver, and shared stories of the territories that made her laugh despite herself. In return, she read aloud from the books he kept, mostly dime, novels and a few classics, her refined voice bringing the words to life in the cozy cabin dot. By the third evening, something had shifted between them. The wariness remained, but alongside it grew a reluctant respect, perhaps even the seeds of trust. "Storm's breaking," Cole observed, watching the clouds thin as the sun set. "We can head for Copper Creek tomorrow." Elizabeth nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang of disappointment. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You haven't imposed," Cole replied, his voice softer than usual. "It's been pleasant having company." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, and Cole cleared his throat, rising to check their supplies. "We should get an early start. It's a full day's ride to Copper Creek, even with good conditions." Elizabeth agreed, retiring early to prepare for their journey. Yet sleep eluded her as she contemplated what awaited in Copper Creek, her uncle's property, if it even existed, and a life alone in a frontier town where she knew no one. After Thomas's death, she had craved independence, but now the prospect seemed daunting. And what of Cole? He would disappear back into the wilderness, hunted for a crime he claimed not to have committed. The injustice of it bothered her more than it should for someone she'd known less than a week. Morning arrived with clear skies and the promise of heat. They packed quickly, leaving the cabin as they'd found it. Cole insisted Elizabeth keep the revolver he'd taught her to use, just in case, though neither specified what that case might be. They rode double on Thunder again, making good time across the muddy terrain. Cole seemed to know every trail and shortcut, avoiding the worst of the flooding with an instinctive understanding of the land. "How long have you been in the territories?" Elizabeth asked as they paused to rest the horse near midday. "Born here," Cole replied, scanning the horizon with habitual caution. "My father ran cattle near Silver Creek before Sherman Holloway decided he wanted our water rights." His jaw tightened. "That was 15 years ago. I've been on the move since." 15 years as a fugitive," Elizabeth murmured. "That's a long time to run." Cole's smile held no humor. "You get used to it. Learn to sleep light, trust no one, keep moving." He adjusted Thunder's saddle. "What about you? What's waiting in Copper Creek besides property?" "Nothing," she admitted. "No family, no friends. Just a deed and hope for a fresh start." Cole studied her with those penetrating blue eyes. "Frontier's no place for a woman alone, especially one unused to its ways." "I'm a quick learner," Elizabeth countered, "and I have nowhere else to go." Before Cole could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Instantly alert, he pulled Elizabeth behind a large boulder, signaling for silence. "Riders," he whispered. "At least 3, maybe 4. Travelers?" Elizabeth suggested hopefully. Cole's expression darkened. "No one uses this trail except those." Avoiding the main road, he peered cautiously around the boulder. 4 men, heavily armed. Bounty hunters, most likely. Elizabeth's heart began to pound. "Looking for you? Let's not wait to find out." Cole led Thunder deeper into a stand of junipers, then helped Elizabeth mount. "There's a canyon about 2 miles east. We can lose them there." They rode hard, but the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. The bounty hunters had spotted them and were giving chase. Cole pushed Thunder to his limits, but the stallion was tiring after carrying double for most of the day. "They're gaining," Elizabeth warned, glancing back at the dust cloud rising behind them. Cole's face was grim as he guided Thunder into a narrow ravine. "Canyon entrance is just ahead. Once inside, there are caves where we can hide." They had nearly reached the canyon when a rifle shot cracked through the air. Elizabeth felt Cole jerk against her, heard his sharp intake of breath. "You're hit," she gasped, seeing blood spreading across his left shoulder. "Keep going," he gritted. Through clenched teeth, maintaining their pace despite the wound, they entered the canyon, its towering walls offering momentary shelter from the rifles. Cole directed Thunder toward a barely visible trail that zigzagged up the canyon wall. The stallion climbed valiantly, but the strain of carrying 2 riders was showing. "We'll never outrun them like this," Cole said, his voice tight with pain. "Thunder can't carry us both much longer." Elizabeth made a swift decision. "Then we separate. I'll create a diversion while you reach the caves." "Absolutely not," Cole objected. "These men are after you, not me," Elizabeth finished. "I'm just a woman lost in the wilderness, remember? They have no reason to harm me." Cole hesitated, clearly torn. "It's too dangerous. More dangerous than being caught together." She met his gaze steadily. "Trust me, Cole. I can do this." After a moment's consideration, Cole nodded reluctantly. "There's a cave entrance behind the split rock formation at the top of this trail. Wait for me there." He handed her his spare canteen. "If I'm not back by nightfall, follow the North Star until you reach the main road to Copper Creek." Elizabeth committed his instructions to memory. "I'll see you before nightfall," she said with more confidence than she felt. They parted ways at the next bend, Cole continuing up the narrow trail while Elizabeth doubled back on foot, making her descent visible to their pursuers. As she'd hoped, Two of the bounty hunters broke off to intercept her, while the others continued after Cole. Elizabeth waited until they approached before calling out, "Thank goodness. I've been lost for days." The bounty hunters reined in, clearly, surprised to find a well-spoken woman alone in the canyon. "Ma'am?" The older one questioned, suspicion warring with confusion on his weathered face. "My stagecoach was attacked by bandits," she explained, drawing on her actual experience with convincing details. "I've been wandering ever since. Are you lawmen?" She allowed her voice to tremble with relief and exhaustion not entirely feigned after their hard ride. The men exchanged glances. "Bounty hunters, ma'am," the younger one replied. "Tracking a dangerous criminal, Cole Blackwood." Elizabeth widened her eyes. "The Ghost Rider? Oh my, I've heard terrible stories. Was that him who brought me here?" "He claimed his name was Smith said. He was taking me to Copper Creek." Her performance struck the perfect note of feminine distress and indignation. The bounty hunters, facing a seemingly helpless lady in distress, found themselves torn between their pursuit and their ingrained sense of chivalry. "Jenkins, take the lady down to the main camp," the older man decided. "Mitchell and I will continue after Blackwood." The younger man nodded, offering Elizabeth his hand. "Come with me, ma'am. You'll be safe now." Elizabeth allowed herself to be helped onto his horse, playing the part of grateful damsel perfectly. As they descended toward the canyon entrance, where a small camp had been established, she studied her surroundings carefully, noting the location of weapons, supplies, and the single remaining horse stout at the camp. Jenkins helped her dismount. "Rest here, ma'am. There's coffee in that pot if you'd like some." "You're too kind," Elizabeth replied with a demure smile. "Might I trouble you for some water first? I'm terribly parched." As Jenkins turned to fetch his canteen, Elizabeth made her move. The revolver Cole had given her was hidden in the folds of her skirt. In one fluid motion, just as Cole had taught her during their days in the cabin, she drew the weapon and brought it down hard against the back of Jenkins. Head bowed, the young bounty hunter crumpled without a sound. Working quickly, Elizabeth bound him with his own rope, then gathered supplies, ammunition, food, water, and a rifle. She hesitated briefly before taking his horse as well, knowing Cole would need a fresh mount. Gunshots echoed from higher in the canyon as she rode out, Cole fighting for his life against the remaining bounty hunters. Elizabeth circled around, following a game trail that led up the opposite wall of the canyon. From this vantage point, she could see the bounty hunters' positions as they pursued, Cole toward the caves, taking careful aim with the rifle and other skill. Cole had taught her during their confinement. Elizabeth fired a shot that kicked up dust near the bounty hunters' horses. The animals reared in panic, throwing one rider and sending the other scrambling for cover. Her second shot struck a rock near Mitchell's head, forcing him to retreat. The diversion gave Cole the opportunity he needed. From her position, Elizabeth saw him reach the cave entrance and disappear inside. The bounty hunters, pinned down by her strategic firing, were unable to follow immediately. As dusk approached, Elizabeth made her way carefully to the rendezvous point Cole had specified. The split rock formation was distinctive, casting long shadows in the setting sun. She approached cautiously, leading Jenkins' horse and scanning for any sign of pursuit. "Cole?" she called softly, reaching the cave entrance. For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response. Then a shadow detached itself from the darkness within. "You're a hell of a shot, Mrs. Caldwell," Cole said, emerging from the cave. His left arm was bound roughly with a bandana, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. Despite his pallor, his eyes were bright with something that might have been admiration. "I had a good teacher," Elizabeth replied, relief washing through her at the sight of him alive. "Though I hope you don't mind that I deviated somewhat from the plan." Cole's laugh was genuine, if pained. Remind me never to underestimate you. Again, he nodded toward the horse she'd brought. Good thinking. Thunder needs rest, and we need to put distance between us and those bounty hunters before they regroup. As night fell, they rode north through the canyon, following hidden trails that Cole navigated with unerring confidence despite his injury. Elizabeth insisted on examining his wound when they paused to rest, a clean shot through the fleshy part of his shoulder, painful but not life-threatening if they could prevent infection. Why didn't you leave me? Cole asked suddenly as she finished rebinding his shoulder. You could have reached Copper Creek with Jenkins, been safe by now. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the bandage. You saved my life in the desert, she said simply. I couldn't leave you to die. But they both knew it was more than that. Something had formed between them in those days of shared confinement. Something neither was ready to name, but both felt with increasing certainty. We'll reach Miller's Crossing by dawn, Cole said after. A moment. Small settlement, but there's a doctor who doesn't ask questions. After that, ... he hesitated. After that, we decide what comes next, Elizabeth finished for him, her hand finding his in the darkness. Chapter 4. Crossroads and Choices. Miller's Crossing proved to be little more than a cluster of buildings surrounding a dusty intersection, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a few modest homes. True to Cole's word, the local doctor asked no questions when they arrived at dawn, simply treating Cole's wound with practiced efficiency. Keep it clean. Change the bandage daily, the elderly physician instructed Elizabeth. No riding for at least 3 days, or he'll start bleeding again. This enforced delay presented a dilemma. They took a room at the small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, whose rheumy eyes missed nothing but whose tongue asked little. Cole registered them as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a fiction Elizabeth accepted without comment, recognizing the necessity of discretion. Their room was small but clean, with a single bed that Cole immediately insisted Elizabeth take while he made do with blankets on the floor. Too exhausted to argue, they both collapsed into much-needed sleep, the events of the previous day having depleted their reserves. Elizabeth awoke late in the afternoon to find Cole sitting by the window, his good arm resting on his revolver as he watched the street below with habitual vigilance. "Any sign of trouble?" she asked, sitting up. Cole shook his head. "Quiet so far, but we can't stay long. Word travels fast in these parts." Over a simple meal brought up by Mrs. Fletcher, they discussed their options in low voices. "Copper Creek is still 3 days' ride northeast," Cole explained, pushing food around his plate with little appetite. "But I can't take you there." "Because of your wound?" Elizabeth asked. "Because Sherman Holloway's brother is the law in Copper Creek," Cole replied grimly. "If I'm recognized, we'll both hang me for murder, you as my accomplice." Elizabeth set down her fork. "Then we need another plan." "What about your name?" "If you've been falsely accused, there must be some way to clear it." Cole's bitter laugh held no humor. "Justice isn't so simple out here. The Holloway's own judges. From here to Santa Fe. There must be someone who would listen. The territorial governor, perhaps?" Elizabeth persisted. "Maybe if I had proof." Cole winced as he shifted position. "But all I have is my word against the most powerful family in the territory." Elizabeth fell silent, considering. Her uncle's property in Copper Creek had represented her only hope for a fresh start. Without it, she had nowhere to go, no resources to draw upon. Yet she couldn't abandon Cole now after everything they'd been through. "What if we found proof?" she suggested. "You said Sherman Holloway was murdered. Someone else pulled that trigger. If we could discover who really killed him." Cole studied her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "That's dangerous thinking, Elizabeth. The kind that gets people killed." "I'm already supposed to be dead," she reminded him. According to the story I told those bounty hunters, I was the sole survivor of a stagecoach robbery. No one is looking for Elizabeth Caldwell. What are you suggesting? That we use this to our advantage?" Her mind raced ahead, forming a plan. "I could go to Copper Creek as planned claim my uncle's property. No one there knows me. While I establish myself, I could ask questions, learn. Who might have wanted Sherman Holloway dead besides you?" Cole shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. The Holloways would have no reason to suspect a widow claiming her inheritance," Elizabeth interrupted. "Women are invisible in men's business, Cole. They'll underestimate me, just as those bounty hunters did." For a long moment, Cole was silent, his blue eyes searching hers. "You'd do that? Risk everything to help clear my name? You saved my life," Elizabeth replied simply. "And I believe in your innocence. Besides," she added with a small smile, "what else am I to do? Return to Boston in disgrace? Become a schoolteacher in some frontier town? This at least offers purpose." Despite his reservations, Cole recognized the determination in her eyes. Over the next 2 days, as his wound began to heal, they refined their plan. Elizabeth would continue to Copper Creek as intended, establish herself at her uncle's property, and begin discreet inquiries. Cole would remain hidden in the hills outside town, where they would meet weekly to exchange information. "If there's any sign of danger, any suspicion at all, you leave immediately," Cole insisted as they prepared for their departure on the 3rd morning. "Promise me, Elizabeth." "I promise," she agreed, though they both knew her word was given primarily to ease his concerns. They traveled together as far as the fork in the road where their paths would diverge, Elizabeth continuing northeast to Copper Creek, Cole heading into the mountains where he could remain safely hidden. "1 month," he said as they paused at the crossroads. "If we haven't found anything by then, we reconsider." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from the man who had become her protector, teacher, and something more undefined during their time together. "Be careful," Cole said softly, his hand brushing hers in a gesture too brief to be called a caress, yet too tender to be merely friendly. "You too," she replied, her voice steadier than her heart. They separated, each riding in opposite directions, both acutely aware that their fates had become inexplicably intertwined. Copper Creek proved larger than Elizabeth had anticipated. Bustling mining town with a main street lined with businesses, several residential streets, and the constant din of the stamp mill crushing ore day and night. Her arrival attracted little attention, which suited her purposes perfectly. The local bank manager, Mr. Winters, verified her documentation with minimal fuss, explaining that her uncle's property lay 3 miles outside town, a modest ranch with good water and 50 acres of grazing land. When Elizabeth inquired about hiring help to run the place, Winters recommended several local men, including a young cowhand named Jake, who became her first employee. Within a week, Elizabeth had established herself as Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell, the quiet widow from Boston who kept to herself, but was unfailingly polite when in town for supplies. She attended church on Sundays, nodded respectfully to Sheriff Holloway when their paths crossed, and gave no one reason to look twice in her direction. But she listened to gossip at the general store, to conversations in the churchyard, too. Jake's casual remarks about local history. Gradually, she began piecing together the circumstances surrounding Sherman Holloway's murder 5 years earlier. The cattle baron had been found shot in his study, the murder weapon missing. Cole Blackwood, whose family ranch had been foreclosed upon by Holloway the previous year, had been seen arguing with the victim that very morning. His hasty departure from the territory had sealed his presumed guilt in everyone's minds. Blackwood always had a temper, Jake commented one evening as they discussed local history. "My pa knew his pa before the troubles," said the whole family. Was too proud to accept when times changed. What kind of man was Sherman Holloway? Elizabeth asked, keeping her tone casually curious. Jake shrugged. Hard but fair, most said. Built the biggest ranch in the territory from nothing. Some resented his success, but that's always the way, ain't it? Not everyone shared this assessment, Elizabeth discovered. The widow Santiago, who ran the town's small restaurant, had lost her husband's mind to Holloway in a dispute over water rights. The blacksmith's daughter had been courted by Holloway despite his marriage, then discarded when she became pregnant. The child, now 5 years old, was the town's open secret. Most intriguing was the relationship between Sherman and his younger brother Lawrence, now the sheriff. According to Mrs. Fletcher's cousin who lived in Copper Creek, the brothers had quarreled bitterly in the weeks before the murder. Some whispered it concerned the division of their father's estate, others that it involved Lawrence's wife Sarah, with whom Sherman had been inappropriately familiar. During her 3rd week in Copper Creek, Elizabeth made her scheduled rendezvous with Cole in the foothills outside town. He had established a small camp in a sheltered canyon, his wound healing well despite the crude conditions. Sheriff Holloway is planning a trip to Santa Fe next week, Elizabeth reported after sharing her discoveries. The entire town's talking about it. Apparently he rarely leaves Copper Creek. Cole considered this information. That could give us an opportunity to search his office. If there's evidence clearing my name, it might be there. That's extremely risky, Elizabeth objected. Breaking into the sheriff's office? Not breaking. Cole clarified. Sarah Holloway has a key. She handles the office when Lawrence is away. How could you possibly know that? A shadow passed over Cole's face. Sarah and I were close before her marriage. Before everything fell apart. This revelation shouldn't have affected Elizabeth as strongly as it did. A sharp pang that felt uncomfortably like jealousy lanced through her. I see, she said, her voice carefully neutral. And you think she'd help you now? I don't know, Cole admitted. But she never believed I killed Sherman. She tried to help me leave the territory when the posse was forming. Elizabeth absorbed this information. Slowly, and I should approach her, not you. A woman speaking to another woman would arouse less suspicion. Cole hesitated, clearly torn between the necessity of the plan and his desire to keep Elizabeth safe. If you do this, he said finally, you need an excuse to visit her. Something natural. The church is organizing a quilting circle at the Holloway. Home tomorrow, Elizabeth replied. I've already been invited. The plan took shape quickly. Elizabeth would attend the quilting circle, assess Sarah Holloway, and, if the woman seemed trustworthy, arrange a private conversation. Meanwhile, Cole would prepare for their potential escape if things went wrong. Fresh horses, supplies, and an alternate route out of the territory. The following afternoon found Elizabeth seated among Copper Creek's leading ladies, needle in hand as she contributed to the community quilt while observing her hostess. Sarah Holloway was younger than Elizabeth had expected, perhaps 30, with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her husband's brash personality. She managed the gathering with graceful efficiency, ensuring every woman felt welcomed and included. When the opportunity arose to help Sarah prepare refreshments in the kitchen, Elizabeth took it. You have a lovely home, Mrs. Holloway, she commented as they arranged cookies on a serving plate. Thank you, Sarah replied with a small smile. And please, call me Sarah. We're not formal at quilting circles. Elizabeth, then, she responded. After a moment's hesitation, she added, I hope you don't mind my saying, but you seem familiar somehow. Have we met before? Sarah studied her curiously. I don't believe so. I've never traveled east. Perhaps it's just one of those strange coincidences, Elizabeth continued casually. My late husband once mentioned business dealings with a man from these parts, Cole Blackwood. The name stuck with me because it was so distinctive. The reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight stiffening of Sarah's shoulders. A momentary pause in her movements. "The Blackwoods were a respected family once," she said carefully. "Before the Troubles." "I've heard rumors about what happened," Elizabeth ventured, "though it's hard to separate truth from gossip in a small town." Sarah glanced toward the parlor, ensuring they remained private. "Why are you really asking about Cole Blackwood, Mrs. Caldwell?" Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Elizabeth took a calculated risk. "Because I believe he may have been wrongly accused, and I think you might believe that too." For a long moment, Sarah was silent, her expression unreadable. Then, "Meet me behind the church tomorrow at noon. Come alone." Without waiting for a response, she picked up the refreshment tray and returned to her guests, her composed smile betraying nothing of their exchange. Elizabeth reported this development to Cole that evening, their meeting hastily arranged at the edge of her property after dark. "Be careful," he warned. "Sarah has everything to lose if Lawrence discovers she's helping us." "Do you trust her?" Elizabeth asked, the question carrying more weight than she intended. Cole's eyes held hers. "In the moonlight, with my life, but not with yours." He hesitated, then added softly, "You've become important to me, Elizabeth, more than I expected, more than is wise." The admission hung between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge its full implications. "Tomorrow may change everything," Elizabeth said instead, "for better or worse." "Whatever happens," Cole replied, "we face it together." The following day dawned clear and hot, the summer sun beating down on Copper Creek's dusty streets. Elizabeth arrived at the church precisely at noon, her heart pounding as she made her way to the small cemetery behind the building. Sarah was already waiting, her face half hidden by a modest bonnet. Without preamble, she pressed a folded paper into Elizabeth's hand. "This is a copy of the letter Sherman wrote the day he died," she explained in a rushed whisper. "Lawrence doesn't know I kept it. It implicates him in land fraud and water rights theft across the territory. When Sherman threatened to expose him, Lawrence—" Her voice faltered. "He killed his own brother?" Elizabeth asked, stunned despite her suspicions. Sarah nodded grimly. "I saw him return that night, blood on his clothes. He claimed it was from a hunting accident, but I knew." By then, Cole had already fled, the perfect scapegoat. "Why didn't you come forward?" "With what proof? My word against the new most powerful man in the territory?" Sarah's bitter laugh held no humor. "Besides, Lawrence made it clear what would happen if I spoke out." Elizabeth carefully tucked the letter into her pocket. "This could clear Cole's name." "It won't be enough," Sarah warned. "You'll need corroborating testimony. Mine, if necessary. Though it would mean—" She didn't finish the thought, the consequences too obvious to state. "Thank you," Elizabeth said simply. "This is a brave thing you're doing." Sarah's smile was sad. "Tell Cole—" She stopped as the church door opened, her expression instantly transforming to casual friendliness. "Yes, Mrs. Caldwell, the missionary. Society always welcomes new members. Do consider joining us next Tuesday." Elizabeth played along, thanking her for the information before they parted ways, Sarah returning to the church, Elizabeth heading toward her waiting horse. She had nearly reached the edge of town when she noticed two men following her deputies from the sheriff's office. Maintaining a casual pace, Elizabeth turned toward the general store instead of the road home, her mind racing. Had they been seen? Was their plan discovered? Inside the store, she browsed merchandise while watching the deputies through the window. They remained outside, clearly waiting. Something had gone wrong. The storekeeper approached with a sympathetic expression. "Sheriff's looking for you, Mrs. Caldwell. Says there's been some question about your property claim. Sent his boys to escort you to his office." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Somehow, Lawrence Holloway had discovered their plan. She needed to warn Cole, but the deputies stood between her and freedom. "How kind of him to send an escort," she replied with forced calm. "I'll go directly, of course." The sheriff's office sat at the end of Main Street, a solid brick building. It also housed the town jail. Elizabeth approached with measured steps, the deputies flanking her like an honor guard or prison escorts. Sheriff Lawrence Holloway awaited her arrival, seated behind his desk with a cold smile that never reached. His eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted as she entered. "Or should I say Mrs. Blackwood?" Elizabeth's heart stuttered, but she maintained her composure. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Sheriff." "My name is Elizabeth Caldwell." Holloway's smile widened as he held up a telegram. "This arrived from Boston this morning. Seems there is no widow named Elizabeth Caldwell, matching your description." He leaned forward. "So I'll ask again. Who are you, and what is your connection to Cole Blackwood?" Before Elizabeth could respond, the office door burst open. Cole stood in the doorway, revolver drawn and aimed directly at the sheriff's heart. "Let her go, Lawrence," he said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between you and me." The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, but Cole's warning was clear. "Don't. You won't clear leather before I put a bullet through you." "Cole Blackwood," Holloway said, his surprise giving way to calculated assessment. "5 years I've hunted. You, and now you walk right into my office. Must be love." His gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "Though I'm curious how you two met. This wasn't a chance encounter, was it?" "We know the truth, Lawrence," Elizabeth said, drawing the letter from her pocket. "About Sherman's murder. About who really pulled the trigger." Color drained from Holloway's face as he recognized the paper. "Where did you get that?" "From someone who saw you return that night with blood on your clothes," Cole replied. "Someone who's kept silent out of fear, not loyalty." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Then Holloway lunged for his gun. The next few seconds passed in a blur of motion and sound. Cole fired, his bullet striking Holloway's arm rather than his heart, a choice Elizabeth recognized instantly as mercy. The sheriff fell back with a cry of pain as the deputies burst in from the adjoining room, guns drawn. "Drop it, Blackwood!" The older deputy shouted. "Wait!" Elizabeth stepped between Cole and the lawmen, the letter held high. "Sheriff Holloway murdered his brother. We have proof." The deputies hesitated, weapons still raised, but uncertainty clear in their expressions. "Read it," Elizabeth urged, offering the letter to the older man. "See for yourself what kind of man you're working for." As the deputy reluctantly took the paper, a new voice entered the confrontation. "I can confirm its authenticity." Sarah Holloway stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolved. "I witnessed my husband return the night of Sherman's murder. I've kept silent too long." The revelation stunned the room into silence. Lawrence Holloway, clutching his wounded arm, glared at his wife with naked hatred. "You treacherous bitch." He spat. "Enough," the older deputy said, having scanned the letter's contents. "Fisher, disarm the sheriff. Mrs. Holloway, you'll need to make a formal statement." He turned to Cole, whose gun remained steadily aimed. "Lower your weapon, Blackwood. Seems we've got a lot to sort out here." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. The territorial judge was summoned from the neighboring town. Statements were taken, evidence examined. Word spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. The sheriff arrested for his brother's murder. Cole Blackwood returned from the dead. The quiet widow from Boston, somehow at the center of it all. By nightfall, Lawrence Holloway sat in his own jail, awaiting transfer to the territorial capital for trial. Cole's official statement had been recorded, the process of clearing his name formally begun. Sarah, freed from years of silent complicity, provided damning testimony about her husband's crimes, beyond the murderland theft, water rights manipulation, witness intimidation. Elizabeth found Cole standing alone on the porch of her small ranch house as dusk settled over the land. After the chaos of the day, the authorities had released him to her custody, a formality until the judicial process could formally exonerate him. "What happens now?" she asked, joining him as he gazed out over the property that might have been hers in another life. "The judge believes the evidence will clear my name," Cole replied. "Might take months for the formal pardon, but at least I'm not running anymore." He turned to face her, his expression uncertain. "The question is, what do you want to happen?" Now? Elizabeth considered the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment, from near death in the desert to partnership, trust, and something deeper neither had fully acknowledged. "My uncle's property claim was fraudulent," she said. "I have no right to this land. You could stay anyway," Cole suggested. "Copper Creek might welcome a schoolteacher or a shopkeeper. You've proven remarkably adaptable." Elizabeth smiled, stepping closer to him. "Is that what you want? For me to stay in Copper Creek while you ... what? Reclaim your family ranch? Return to wandering?" Cole's hand found hers, his touch gentle but certain. "What I want," he said softly, "is to stop pretending I haven't fallen in love with you, Elizabeth. Whether that means building a life here or somewhere far from Copper Creek, I just wanted to be with you." The admission so plainly stated. After weeks of careful restraint left Elizabeth momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, the words came with absolute certainty. "I want that too," she whispered. "Wherever we go, whatever we build together." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Cole drew her into his arms. Their kiss held the promise of a future neither had dared imagine when fate first brought them. Together on the edge of death in the merciless desert, the journey ahead would not be easy rebuilding Cole's name, establishing their place in a community that had long believed him a murderer, reconciling their different backgrounds and experiences. But they would face these challenges, as they had faced all others since that first encounter together, with courage and unwavering trust in each other. For a woman on the verge of death and the mysterious cowboy who saved her, it was just the beginning.